Really great to be here at MWC again. It's my second time in a row. Nishant, have you been to many an MWC over the years?
Yeah, when you work in telecommunications, even if you don't want to, you have to come to MWC.
It's kind of the event that you've got to like.
It is the event to
keep
be
coming
at.
back.
Yes.
As much as you, perhaps might like not to, you always kind of come back eventually. Really good to chat to you, Nishant, and I think kind of going into the history of Nokia a bit. I mean, this is a company that's pioneered through the ages, from the creation of the telephone back in the 19th century all the way to today with 5G and Metaverse and all the sort of cutting edge technologies. You've just had a rebrand at Nokia. Talk to me about that a little bit and what was behind the thinking there.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Nokia has had a very privileged and good legacy, good parts and bad parts. In some senses, if you go back, 15 years, Nokia was the first true hyperscaler. Nokia phones were sort of ubiquitous, right? And then, of course, the business went through a very turbulent phase. And then we reinvented ourselves as a B2B company. And we have done reasonably well in that regards. The business is in good standing in terms of, growth over the last few years. And we have pivoted away completely from cell phones. And now we focus exclusively on B2B, where our customers are service providers, our customers are cloud players, our customers are enterprises, in some cases, governments, right? So we are not a cell phone provider. And it was time. 60 years, the brand was existing for 60 years. So it was really a time for us to change and present to the world what our vision for 2030 is, and what our purpose in this environment is, and how our strategy is to now be a B2B tech leader, and the brand was needed to reflect that. So that's why we had a brand relaunch yesterday. I should proudly show this.
Pretty nifty merch.
Yes. So the new Nokia is present here at MWC now.
And the new Nokia, that stands for, looking at the forward-looking technologies, one of which is the Metaverse, which I know we're kind of here to talk about today. Can you just run the attendees here at MWC through what is the Metaverse and how can companies actually generate lucrative business models out of this?
Yeah, I think this is I was at the brand launch yesterday joking that if there's any company here at MWC that doesn't talk to you about the Metaverse, it's a shock. Because everybody's talking about the Metaverse. To us, Metaverse is not a singular, it's a plural. It's metaverses. There is no one Metaverse that suddenly that we all will have a digital avatar and will show up, in a Metaverse. To us, Metaverse has three different categories. There is a consumer Metaverse, which is probably the most often talked about, which pertains to social, entertainment, gaming, etc. Then there's a Metaverse which is driven through enterprise, which is for collaboration, co-creation, ideation, trainings. And then there is an industrial OT-driven Metaverse, which to us at Nokia is the most exciting form of it. This is around getting productivity, safety, and efficiency. I'll give you an example, right? If you have a power plant and you have minimal downtime at the power plant, because a real-time digital twin allows you to sort of rectify the issue before it manifests in the real power plant. That's a productivity gain. To us, that's a true use case of a Metaverse. So to us, it's the last part. That's the industrial usage of the Metaverse, of that digital twin augmented with a human, is the most exciting piece.
How much take-up is that really seeing in the market? Because we've seeing a lot of talk about the Metaverse, and obviously there are companies, Meta itself, investing billions of dollars to make this a reality, but really, yet, there's no clear example of that as a viable commercial product just yet.
Of course, if we sort of restrict the definition of the Metaverse to be, head-mounted displays for virtual reality, the market is fairly limited. And the take-up is questioned, of course, by everyone. But that is not the definition of Metaverse that I want to go by. If, let's say, everyone has a cell phone here, just Google a digital twin for a factory, or Google a digital twin for a physical object. You will get plenty of examples. Digital twins have now started to exist. For example, we're in telecom business. The base business is telecom very much. We have digital twins for our products. Our customers have digital twins of their networks for real-time automation. This is becoming a reality. You don't have to always enjoy or entertain to use a metaverse. In this case, you can actually, in a very pragmatic way, deploy a metaverse through a real-time digital twin. And those have begun to exist now. Of course, over the rest of the decade, they will mature. Digital twins will become more complex. They will be more holographic. The quality and performance of some of the devices will increase. The application set will expand. But we have started to see some real industrial uses already.
Definitely. I do think, though, that, kind of going back to that metaverse and where it's sort of being taken, I mean, the amount of computing power that is kind of needed for that is going to be exponential. But potentially a really good kind of tailwind for a business like Nokia, which is kind of at the heart of that, making all the pipes that generate that stuff in the first place. How are you positioned from a kind of capital expenditure side as that grows and becomes more prominent over the years?
There is things that we think we have a right to play in today, and there are areas where we have to earn a right to be on that table, right? So if you look at metaverse, and if you can only enjoy the metaverse from the comfort of your couch or your bedroom, that's a very limited view of the metaverse. If metaverse is truly mobile and mixed reality happens around us, then you will need a completely different underlying fabric called the network. The network will have to evolve. In fact, a lot of the use cases that we are already researching pertaining to 6G are driven by industrial metaverse today. We announced yesterday publicly what we do with Bosch, for example, and in their factory of the future. So in this case, you will need an underlying fabric, the network, which has evolved significantly. And that's a clear opportunity for us. That's also the vision that we carry, and sort of the brand relaunch was based on that. But then there are areas where, Nokia does play in when traditional OEMs don't play in. For example, we have the Bell Labs research facilities, and we are doing, for example, real-time sensor analysis, and we're putting that software on our edge compute nodes. We're looking at how do drones work in factories and what kind of localization can we achieve there. So those are new use cases and software that we are investing in, and those are growth areas for us in that case. We don't expect ourselves to be a player in the head-mounted display as a market leader, but we want to be part of that ecosystem that enables the metaverse.
But I want to pick up on something that your CEO, Pekka, said in an interview recently around the rebrand. One thing he was saying was that Nokia could actually become more of a competitor to tech companies as it expands into different verticals, different areas. Is that something that you sort of kind of agree with?
It depends on how you define the tech companies, right? Today, again, maybe the definition of tech company is important here. We today serve the needs of almost every telecom provider in the world. What Pekka is alluding to is that there is a lot of enterprise usage of what we produce today. So we want to make sure that we provide our solutions or services to those plethora of enterprises. And then, of course, will we compete with the Cisco? Absolutely we will, because Cisco is, playing in that field.
Yeah.
Will we compete with players like Arista? Yes, we will.
And 6G. I want to talk about 6G because there's a lot of talk here about 6G. What is it?
6G to me is two things. It's the next generation of wireless access, the last mile access. Of course, that's the easy definition. But if we do one more generation of wireless access, in fact, if you go back to the MWC pre-COVID, let's go back to maybe 2019, 2018 timeframe. The big talk was 5G is about to get launched, and 5G has got launched, and now, almost all of us has at some point enjoyed the value of 5G. But if we do one more generation like the one we have done, I think we will do our industry and this world a disservice. 6G has to be now. So 5G has started to become a platform for digitalization. 5G advanced will further propel that digitalization, but 6G cannot be thought of. Okay, 6G, I see 4 bars and it says 6G. I think that would be a massive disservice to our industry and this world. 6G has to be the platform for digitalization. And we can already start to sense that, right? Now we see a lot of industry, a lot of companies, governments, regulators start to say, hey, 6G is going to be that fabric. 5G has started to show and pave the way towards that already. So I'm excited about what we're going to build. In a true sense, 5G leading to a revolution called 6G.
Are we getting ahead of ourselves talking about 6G, just given the fact that 5G has only kind of barely taken off? And I mean, really, are there any lessons that we can learn from that rollout? Because of course you saw companies like Huawei have to deal with restrictions. It meant that they couldn't kind of be as involved in, certainly the UK 5G rollout. But more broadly, it doesn't seem like 5G has kind of taken off consumer level, certainly, enterprise to a certain extent, in the way that a lot of the sort of telcos would have liked.
Yeah, and in some sense, we as telecom industry should take blame for that, right, as well, right? We've been too focused on consumer. So, yes, there are lessons to be learned. A technology to be successful, the first thing, the oxygen that the wireless industry breathes on is spectrum. Today, the spectrum that 5G is deployed on is still very much the old 4G spectrum. In most of the countries, the true 5G spectrum called the mid-band hasn't been deployed yet, or in any volume. In the US, in Korea, yes, but many countries, and here in Europe, that mid-band spectrum called 5G, where the true value comes through, hasn't been deployed yet. So is it sufficient to just change the signal and the symbol on the phone? No. A lot of 5G has to get deployed, even from here on. And the lessons to be learned is make sure the right spectrum is available. It makes the biggest difference. The digital dividend that a regulator provides the industry is called the spectrum. And when the spectrum is available, the value of the technology goes massively higher. So we have to learn how to get spectrum right for any subsequent generation, and even for 5G in the second half of 5G. We have to also learn from 5G that the use cases, in terms of now with 5G, now I'm getting a little technical, the standalone architecture of 5G, how much of that is deployed? We have just evolved 4G to 5G for a better consumer experience. Now with 6G, will we follow the same evolution pattern? Likely not. We have to think through how the true enterprise use cases come through. How much IoT is on 5G? Zero. Zero IoT on 5G today. IoT exists on 2G or 4G right now. So we have to start thinking of these things in formative stages of 6G.
Yeah. Why do you think that is, that 5G just hasn't kind of taken off in the way that it should have?
Well, think about this. The opportunity of consumer is so big that everybody focuses on that first.
Yeah.
And then if a competitor in a market starts to win in 5G because they have 5G and you don't, what do? You run behind them and catch up. And then I think 5G for consumer is getting to a point where it's giving way to 5G for enterprise. I'll give you an example. So enterprise-based last mile 5G, our shipments for those private networks have gone up 8x. Not 2, not 3, year on year 8x. So at Nokia, when we ship a private network to an industry, we are then shipping 8 times more in 2022 versus what we were doing in 2021. So but the numbers are still very small. And our expectation is that at the end of the decade, it will be a substantial part of our shipments.
How substantial?
We think is the market, overall wireless market, will be somewhere between private wireless versus consumer-led wide area network, will be somewhere between 25 to 30% of the whole market. And that starts to be significant and material. So our investors are asking us, are you winning this race? Because this race will be material to your delivery in the second half of the decade.
And it's also a question, isn't it, of if Nokia isn't the winner in that space, who will be? And I know there's a lot of Chinese telecom companies who are around representing today, there is a geopolitical component here, isn't there? The fact that the US wants to be a leader in the next generation technologies, China wants to be a leader in global standards, Europe seems to want to be a leader in kind of regulating and making sure that is all kind of sound from a regulatory perspective. Who is going to be the leader in 6G? Is it too early to sort of tell at this stage?
I think the first thing is, it's too early to tell. The first thing is, by every continent or country wanting to be a leader is sort of validation that technology will carry a lot of value. So there's already validation in the thesis that 6G will be a massive infrastructure digitalization play. Otherwise, why would they care? Two, when I talk about these technologies, it is important to think of global rather than local, because if you have different standards in different parts of the world, that is massive value destruction. So if you go back to 3G, China had a different standard, US had a different standard, or at least half of US, and Europe had a different standard. So China was deploying TDS CDMA for 3G, US was half CDMA going to EVDO and other half going to UMTS, and Europe was fully commissioned to GSM and UMTS. That was a disaster. We broke the world into different parts, lowered the scale. Who suffered? Consumers suffered. Then in 4G we got it together, and we set one standard. In 5G we have managed to keep it together, and it's important that these global standards don't deviate from one track, because this gives you the maximum value in terms of the consumer and the enterprise. Now, who will capture the value in which continent and which country? I think time will tell. It is important, though, the basic principles are global.
Yeah, you've got to ensure that standard is set, because otherwise you're going to have different variations and it just doesn't work.
Imagine if your device, let's say a mixed reality device, works well in UK, but when you now start traveling, you go to Asia and it doesn't work. That will be a problem. And then you have to buy another $1,500 device. I don't think people will do that.
No, certainly not. So I want to get into another topic that's been very highly debated and highly contested here. I mean, this morning you had a speech from Commissioner Breton talking about big tech companies and how much they should kind of fork out for the development of next generation networks, 6G arguably being one of those eventually. Where do you and where does Nokia stand on this debate? Do you think that it's time that companies like Netflix, Amazon, Meta, do they need to pay their fair share?
I think there's a couple of things here. This fair share debate is, of course, very hot in Europe right now. Let's see like this. If you have, eventually, the regulator and the administration, they want to make sure that the citizens of that area get the most out of any technology deployment. And then comes the value appropriation of the rest of the value chain. I think that's how I would think, saying, are Europeans getting the best return of any investment? Then if there are 5 operators in a country in Europe, that is pretty crappy business for every telco in Europe. So they have to also manage as to how the telco value chain is. Should there be 3? Should there be 2, 1? And then should the over-the-top players contribute to this? I think it's a sensitive debate, one that I don't think we have a clear answer to. I don't have a clear answer to. I cannot claim to be a politician. I'm so far away from that, thank God. But it is important that within the telecom industry, while we think fair share is the right way to go, which might be the case, it is also imperative on us that we as players in this industry, us as providers and as equipment providers and solution providers and our customers, think about co-creation and co-innovation so that this industry can thrive beyond the limits it has in the recent past. So let's not only say that fair share will solve our problems, we also have to take the onus of innovation and co-creation together to breach the ceiling that we have come to in this industry.
Yeah, and I think you're starting to see that. We saw some news today as well about the likes of Google and Microsoft actually partnering with the telcos to make them more tech-enabled, to make them more kind of advanced. So I think that partnership component is definitely
It's part of it. But there also has to be a lot of organic shift in the mindset we have. Price cannot be the only way we can compete in this market. There has to be creation and innovation that I think in this industry has certainly lagged over the last decade. And I take some blame to that as well.
Certainly. I want to take the opportunity to look to the audience, and if anybody in the audience has any particular questions for this chat, please do raise your hands, and I think we're going to get some Q&A. I unfortunately cannot see anybody, so I might need a bit of assistance here. That the light is so bright. Anyone want to ask Nishant a question? I think. Okay.
I think I
there's
see a
somebody over
hand.
there. Can we get a microphone over to?
Thank you for the interesting conversation. So, looking at emerging markets, high demography, but very maybe increasing smartphone penetration, but not yet to the point where everybody has a VR headset. How do we go about in the next decades markets like Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia? How do we go about making this technology available for them to test, deploy, and consume?
It's a very, very, very good question. Because if we were to produce this thing called the Metaverse only for developed economies and for the top of the pyramid, and it's not inclusive enough, I think we've screwed up massively. So in this case, we have to start thinking of the value chain again and say, how do we now get the cost points right for some of this technology? Equally important, let's not let's not predicate the use case. Those economies, the use cases for this industrial metaverse will be different. They're not outrightly looking at lowering the labor cost only. They're looking at a very different use case for productivity and sometimes safety. So I think it's important that in the formative stages, we are inclusive in the research that we do so that we are keeping in mind what use cases would be applicable to Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or India, or those are very important. And it is unfortunate that in most previous generations, we've always thought about how do we do it right for the top of the pyramid. In 5G, we actually did quite well, from spectrum allocation, etc. I think we need to do the same and more in 6G and Metaverse. 6G and Metaverse will not work if we are not inclusive in our mindset day one.
Thank you for that question. I think we've got another. Is there anybody else who has a question? Over here?
Hello, thank you for the great presentation, and you did drop the word digital twins quite a lot, which is something that I paid attention to. I do see a lot of the conferences here mentioning industrial use cases for digital twins, so in a very sort of tech-heavy or engineering precision-heavy case. Do you see use cases also on the creative side, so in music or in the arts, or those kinds of sectors for digital twins?
Those digital twins in some sense already exist. Now, when we call a digital twin, I think I'm not talking about generative AI producing music or producing art. Separate things. I'm talking about a physical object having a cyber representation in this case, right? So if you are talking about how we can produce art or music digitally, those exist. But I wouldn't classify them in digital twinning in the classic case of Metaverse. Very interesting technologies, but separate paths. I hope I answered the question. Thank you.
I may interject, unless anyone has any more questions. I wanted to kind of expand on that. I know we're kind of short for time, but we are the last ones of the day, so I feel like I might be justified. Generative AI is such a buzzy kind of phenomenon at the moment. I mean, everybody's talking about what they can make with these things. I've had a bit of fun with it myself. How does a business like Nokia benefit from that? I mean, and how are you looking at AI? There's been a lot of talk about how AI can optimize the networks, for instance? Is that something that you're thinking of implementing in your strategy?
Yeah, I sort of walked into that question, didn't I? So for us, I mean, like every other industry, artificial intelligence is sort of pervasive, it's across. We have substantial investments in the space. I'll give you an example. It's at our booth as well. If somebody wants to try that demo out, today the way wireless telecommunications networks works is the network asks your device, "How are you doing? How are your circumstances? Shall I give you resources or not?" And the device says, "I'm in great radio condition. Give me resources." The network says, "Here you go." But it's a very closed loop, simple system that actually loses resources in just the quest of asking those questions. Now, if this was AI based, the network would actually using convolutional network, those training models, would know what your current circumstances are and allot you resources. So we are starting to now research a lot, and we expect 6G will be built on AI as the air interface. The network will have a lot of predisposed knowledge on the users and subscribers, and that will increase the collective performance of the network. That's just one example. I can give you hundreds of others where AI will be used. Now, the specific question around generative AI. Generative AI is today largely, everybody has heard about ChatGPT. If you have not heard about it, I would be shocked. Generative AI in terms of consumer context is not what we think of. We think of large language models. We think of foundational models. Can we train our software for co-pilot reasons in those training models and get software efficiencies out of them? Absolutely. And I can tell you, if any company that does software today of any volume doesn't think of those generative AI large language models and training their own business with that, keeping in mind, of course, the legalities and privacy of your product, I think you will miss a beat. So I think in the second half of this decade, it will be commonplace.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to see how that eventually comes into place. But Nishant, I think that's a good point to end the conversation. Thanks so much for
Thank you.
agreeing